All right, a couple months ago, Brother Freddie asked me if I wanted to teach again, and I just told him that I was interested in Israel. And why is that? I told him I've heard for 25 years in church that we're to support Israel, but beyond that, I didn't know much about the history of the nation, of the people, and just kind of understanding the politics behind Israel and kind of the promises. So I said, I'm just going to learn about it. So I told Brother Freddie last night when we were going through this, I said, man, I've learned all these terms I've always heard: West Bank, Gaza, Palestinians. I had no clue really what it meant. I'd heard the terms. So for the last 3 weeks, I've read multiple books, just a bunch of stuff, and I'm trying to condense this thing down probably into about 3 weeks. Today's going to be kind of an introduction into kind of the formation or the promise of Israel. Next week will be the biblical history of Israel. And then the third week is really what I spent the bulk of my time on, is modern day Israel, starting with kind of the movement of the Jews to the land of Israel in the late 1800s through events of yesterday. And I mean January the 25th, 2025, there was some stuff that happened. So that's kind of the breakdown of the class. All right, part one. Ask Brother Freddie, he'll know. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything. He already touched on that him and Clint are going to do some prophetical stuff. I'm also not going to be able to touch on the entire history. That would be months and months. And then the modern day stuff, if you hit on everything, it'd be months and months. There's a guy that his kid plays basketball with Ty at their school, and he's been to Israel 41 times, and this is kind of his thing. And I was sitting at dinner with him after a basketball game this week, and I said, Rod, I'm getting frustrated because I'm having a hard time putting the pieces of this puzzle together. And he said, why are you frustrated? This is a 4-year college degree. And he talked about people that do Middle East studies for 4-year college degrees. So the point is, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So I'm trying to really hit the major points, and I'll let Brother Freddie fill in. Some stuff I won't get to. Zach asked me last week, who is a Jew? And I said, I'm going to try to answer that. And that is a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I know it's is it the people that live in Israel? Is it bloodline? Is it adopting the religion? So at the end of each class, I'm going to hit some stuff that I want Brother Freddie to cover, and that's going to be one of those things. All right. Part two. They got a good price. In 1982, a Palestinian militant group called Hezbollah was formed. Who's heard of Hezbollah? I've heard the name. I didn't really know what it was. I knew it was something to do with the Middle East. Well, they were formed in a country called Lebanon. You know where Lebanon's located at? Well, look out on the map, but it's directly north of Israel. So you have Israel, and the borders, the northern part of the state of Israel is Lebanon. So beginning in October of 2023, Hezbollah from Lebanon begins launching rockets into Israel, killing civilians. Israel responds with launching rockets into Lebanon. In February of 2024, so approximately a year ago, Hezbollah gets news or catches wind that the Israeli military is tracking Hezbollah by their smartphones. So head of Hezbollah security calls the Hezbollah members in and says, we're going to have to get rid of our smartphones. We're going to have to start using pagers because you can't track pagers, right? So they go to a company called Gold Apollo. This was a Taiwanese pager company that they have purchased pagers from back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So they go to this company called Gold Apollo and they order 5,000 beepers, like, we probably all had 25 years ago. So beginning in the spring of last year in 2024, Hezbollah, about 5,000 pagers were in use, these Gold Apollo pagers, and they were working as planned. The reports were that Israel was not able to track these. They were able to kind of remain their covert operations and their mission against Israel. But on September the 17th of 2024, 5,000 Hezbollah members found out that these were not normal pagers. In the afternoon of September 17th, a code was sent to every one of the pagers. An error code was sent on the pagers. So the owners of the pagers, the Hezbollah members, look at it, they get an error message, and within seconds, every pager exploded. The explosion blew off limbs and fingers of the Hezbollah members. 300 Hezbollah members had both eyes blown off. 1,500 members of Hezbollah were injured, and 42 were killed. The next day, on September the 18th, walkie-talkies that Hezbollah had purchased began exploding. So Israel pulled off a plan that they had years in the making. They called it, anybody know what they called it? Operation Grim Beeper. What we're going to see here is a Hezbollah member that's wearing a blue baseball hat at a fruit stand in Lebanon. He has his pager in his pocket, or in actually like a hip satchel. This is the afternoon of September 17th, 2024. So we'll talk about this in a second, but notice this Hezbollah member's leg gets blown off. Everybody around him is fine. So it was a very targeted attack by the Israelis on the Hezbollah militants. All right, so how did they pull this off? This is what got me interested. I heard about the pager thing. I said, how did they pull it off? All right, so in 2022, 2 years before this event, a company called BAC Consulting reaches out to Gold Apollo and tells Gold Apollo, we need to buy about 5,000 pagers. Well, unknown to Gold Apollo, BAC Consulting wasn't just somebody looking to buy pagers. It was actually a shell company that the Israeli military had set up. Once they purchased these pagers, they then removed the battery, placed 3 grams of an explosive they call PETN behind the battery, reinserted the battery, and put a new cover on the battery. Even Hezbollah has come out and said it was completely undetectable. They ran these things to check them, and nothing popped up to show that anything was different about them. The Mossad is Israel's intelligence committee, kind of like the CIA here. The Mossad then starts testing these pagers on dummies. They've got videos where a dummy and the thing would explode, so they would get just the right explosion, so it would harm the Hezbollah member, but not the civilians around them. The Mossad then started testing which beep would cause the biggest reaction. So based on the sound and the pitch of the beep, so they wanted to make sure that this got the biggest reaction from the Hezbollah members when the page went off. They then started testing the amount of time between the beep and the time the Hezbollah member got the pager to his face. So they tested it to get down to right. They wanted a certain amount of time between the beep and bring it up to their face. And this is the interesting part. They had these advertisements. The Mossad started running these fake advertisements in Lebanon for these new pagers, touting the benefits of the new pager, saying, oh, this has the longest battery life, it's waterproof, everybody needs these new pagers, they're undetectable. They started running YouTube ads as well that were targeted towards these Hezbollah members. And then, so how did they get it in the hands of these Hezbollah members? They reached out to women who worked for the real Gold Apollo, offered them jobs, who had the connections, and then these women that they hired said, hey, we want you to sell these new and improved pagers to all your Hezbollah clients. So these women were used as pawns and had no idea. So the title to this part is They Got a Good Deal, or They Got a Good Price. It was a 60-minute interview in December where the interviewer for 60 minutes interviewed one of the Mossad agents who was over this program with the pagers. And so the lady interviewing the Mossad agent says, so Hezbollah purchased bombs that ended up killing them? And the Mossad agent said, yep, but we gave them a real good price on them. Zechariah 12:2. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about. when they saw siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. So there's really two main themes that I found from my readings about the history of Israel. One, we'll see throughout, God has a purpose for this land and for these people. We've always heard that. We're going to kind of see it, the nuts and bolts of that. And then two, the Israeli people, the Jews are going to go through, they're going to do anything they can to protect their land and their people. And this Operation Grim Reaper is one example. We'll cover a ton of them over the next couple of weeks of stuff they've done to protect their land and their people. All right. Part 3, honey, pack your bags. Let's do a little bit of laying groundwork in regards to Israel. Okay. Who studied a world map lately? Not me. All right, so here is the world. There's a lot of land there. How big is Israel compared to the entire world? All right, so I had to put an arrow there because what I pulled this is red, and you can't even hardly see it. So if you see, Israel lies right there between Africa and Asia. It's considered in Asia, but it's that tiny little sliver of land right there that between Africa, Asia, and Europe. That's where it's located on the world map. The size of it. Brother Bob said it's the size of California. I'm going to disagree with him. The most equivalent United States state based on square mileage is New Jersey. Wow. 8,630 square miles. Israel is. New Jersey's 87. So New Jersey's bigger than the state of Israel. From the most northern point to the most southern point, it's only 261 miles. It's only 71 miles apart at its widest part. At its most narrow part, it's only 6 miles apart. So it's a tiny little sliver of land. Just to put it into context that we understand, I looked up Georgia's square mileage. Georgia's square mileage is approximately 59,000. Our state is 7 times larger than the state of Israel. So that tells you the size of this land. All right, so you want to take a flight to Israel. So I looked this up. If you fly from Atlanta to Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv's a city in Israel. It's right there on the coast. That's the major airport there in Jerusalem. Any idea how long that flight is? 6,439 miles. If you can get a direct flight, almost 13 hours to fly there. But there's no direct flight. The quickest you're going to get there is about 17 hours and 21 minutes. So it's a 17-hour time commitment to get there. I searched on Delta. The cheapest basic economy flight that you can get round trip to Tel Aviv right now is about $2,300. So that's what you're going to commit to getting there. Once you land in Tel Aviv, you've got about a 41-mile drive to get into the heart of Jerusalem. So you've got about an hour drive to even get to where a lot of Americans will go to go to Jerusalem. All right. Once there, are you going to be able to communicate with anyone? That's what I thought. I was like, the national language is Hebrew. And they said basically the entire country speaks Hebrew. But from what I read, beginning in 1940, all of the schools in Israel do teach English, and 85% of the Israelites or the Jews that live in Israel can speak some level of English. So you will be able to communicate some ways if you were to go there. All right, so here's a map, and we're going to cover this a lot later, but I wanted to kind of understand the groundwork of what surrounds Israel. The arrows may have just made it more cluttered. But anyway, so you got Israel. Directly to the north is Lebanon. We've already talked about them with the Hezbollah. And then directly to the east is Syria and Jordan. We'll talk a lot about Jordan when we get into the West Bank. And then directly to the south is Egypt. And of course, Egypt plays a major role in the biblical history. And then to the west, Israel is protected by the Mediterranean Sea. Some other countries that are going to come into play in our study is to the north of Syria is Turkey. And then out east is Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And we've heard that. We're going to learn more about it in a couple of weeks about Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia's position with Israel too, and I think we know. But we're going to look at some specific instances and wars. What's not on there is everybody's probably heard of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We'll talk about that. But there's two little carve-outs in Israel. The West Bank is up close to Jordan, kind of in the center of the state, and then Gaza is a small strip right there just north of Egypt. But we'll cover that extensively with some maps and go over it. All right, the people of Israel, 9.75 million people live in the nation of Israel right now. As you can see, about 73% are Jews. The city of Jerusalem is just short of 1 million people, so it's the most concentrated area. Israel, the population is 1,098 people per square mile. Just to give context, Georgia is about 142. 142 people per square mile. I thought this was interesting. In the late 19th century, this land was 85% Muslim, 10% Christian and Jewish. They combined those together. But between 1882 and the 30 years after that, 55,000 Jews moved into the area. So we'll start talking about how that population flips in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And we'll talk about the Zionist movement. But anyway, so now you can see the population has completely shifted to where it's majority Jewish. The government. The what is analogous is the Congress here, or our House of Representatives. There's the Israeli government's the Knesset. There's 120 people that are elected to the Knesset. Every 4 years they have this election. Now, within the Knesset, they have all these different political parties. Whichever political party wins the most seats gets to choose the prime minister and the president. So the Knesset, in this instance, chose a president. The president here is largely ceremonial. It's not like our president. They said that basically he shows up to events, but he doesn't really have any authority. All the authority in Israel flows through the prime minister. The prime minister is the chief executive and makes all military decisions, political decisions. The current president is Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll discuss him a lot in 2 weeks. Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is his third run as prime minister. He was a prime minister from 96 to 99. He was taken out of office and then comes back in office in 2009 and serves for 12 more years. And then he recently got reelected in December of 22. Now, down in the bottom corner, I've got Fatah and Hamas. Fatah is the main political group that runs the West Bank that we'll talk about, and the Hamas is the political group that runs the Gaza Strip that we'll cover here in just a few minutes. See if there's anything else on there. All right, heading that way. All right, so when did the nation of Israel start? Well, the first mention of it is in Genesis 11 and 12, and this is what we've always heard. So here, Genesis 11:31, we start seeing the first steps in God moving his people to this particular land that he's identified for them. Genesis 11:31, it says, "And Terah took Abram his son, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there." All right, so what I do is try to highlight a map. Abraham lives in Ur. His family moves up to Haran. That's a 600-mile journey from Ur to Haran. And then once he gets there, we'll talk about what happens. So Genesis 12:1, "Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee." So it looks like in Genesis, the early parts of Genesis, Abram really doesn't even know where he's going. He's just following God's direction, and God's going to direct him to this particular land. God then makes his first promise to Abram in Genesis 12:2, "And I will make thee a great nation." Verse 4, "So Abram departed He was 75 years old. And then in verse 5, and they went forth into the land of Canaan, and into Canaan they came. So that's another 400 miles there. So it was a 1,000-mile journey from Abram to go from up to Haran and then back down to Canaan. So my practical question is what? That's a long way around to get to Canaan. It's about a 300 miles from what I've read, 300 to 400 miles to get if he'd just went straight across. The only analogy I could think of would be somebody like living in Villarica, and then you, like, for example, would move all the way to Texas just to come all the way back to Villarica. Like, it just doesn't make sense. But I don't know. But I guess God has a plan for all of us on our movements.
That's a long way. That is a long way.
I was hoping to Texas was going to be 600 miles, but it's not. It's about 1,100 something. It was really going to fit in. The covenant. All right, so what promise does God make for this land? One, there's two main parts here to Genesis 17:8. This is kind of the crux of the land. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art called a stranger. Thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So God promises really two things here. All the land of Canaan, and then also it's going to be everlasting. What is all the land? So God describes what all the land is in two parts in Genesis. He gives a general description to Abraham on what the land Israel's going to have in Genesis 13. He tells Abram to look northward and southward and eastward and westward. And he says, this is your land. Well, I guess depending on his vision, who really knows what those borders are? But then God does get more specific in Genesis 15:18. And he tells him the land is going to be from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. And that's what map we have over there. You've got the river of Egypt that's flowing through all the way up through the Euphrates. And if you look, that Euphrates is that's in that same region where he went from up to Haran as well. But anyway, so you see that's the amount of land that was promised to the Israelites in Genesis 15. I thought this was interesting. And all the studies that I was reading, it said Israel today only occupies about 15 to 18% of the actual land they're promised. And I saw those two numbers, and it hit me when I was doing these slides a couple days ago. I said, Genesis 15:18. So there's a way to remember it. Genesis 15:18 is the promise. 15 to 18% is kind of how much they have right now. Okay, so we had this discussion last night. Brother Freddie mentioned that the land, there's kind of some new, Genesis describes the land. Ezekiel 47 talks about kind of the way the land will be divided in the future. And this will be kind of more for Clint and Brother Freddie to talk about. But this is just so it's on your radar. Ezekiel 47 and 48 talks about how that land's going to be divided. It literally looks like it's just blocks of land that he describes there in Ezekiel 47 and 48. 47 is kind of general. 48 starts breaking down the different tribes and how the land will be divided. All right, part 5, the fight begins. So it doesn't take long for the land and fights to begin. We've identified what the land's going to be and what we're promised. Everything doesn't end peacefully there. All right, let's do a quick recap of the founding of Islam, which is basically the cause of the war that we're dealing with today. All right, so Genesis 16, Abraham has a child with Hagar. Hagar's an Egyptian. The son's name is Ishmael. Genesis 21, Abraham then has a child with Sarah, Isaac. So we have the two players in this story, Ishmael and Isaac. Genesis 21, Sarah catches the Egyptian child Ishmael mocking Isaac. So Sarah goes to Abraham and says, I want them out of this land. Abraham does as his wife requests. He sends Hagar and Ishmael out of the land, sends them to the Arab country east of Israel. But before, I misspelled it, before Ishmael is removed from the land, God promises to make a great nation from him as well. So we'll touch on that later. So Ishmael, what do we know about Ishmael? It says he's a wild man who shoots arrows. He wants to fight everyone. In Genesis 16:12 said his hands will be against every man's hand and every man's hand against him. He mocks an Israelite. He settles in Paran, which is in Egypt, and he marries an Egyptian. I just thought it's what you read and hear about the Arabs now. You know, the very first one is like a fighter who's just aggressive. So, all right, the fallout of Ishmael. One, we've just heard that Abraham has two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. But in Genesis 22, when Abraham is taking Isaac to sacrifice him, God tells him, take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac. What does that mean? That's probably going to be on Brother Freddie's watch, but we talked about that, about the lineage. So he had birth sons, but there's a difference there between the son of Isaac and the son of Ishmael. Two, Ishmael is the father of the Muslim faith. There's a lot of stuff written on this, but I just pulled this. It says Ishmael is recognized as an important prophet of Islam. Muslims believe that Muhammad was the descendant of Ishmael who would establish a great nation. So there's that not only land divide, but also the spiritual divide between the two. And then three, we're told that these Muslims, or the Arabs, Palestinians, whatever we're going to call them, are going to prosecute the Jews. In Galatians 4, Paul says he says, I'm going to give you an allegory. And an allegory is basically just, I'm going to give you a story that's going to relate that we can apply to our life. So he starts talking about Isaac and Ishmael, and he says that Ishmael was born after the flesh in verse 23, and then he says, he that is born after the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted him that was born after the spirit, Isaac. Even so it is now. So that basically the prophecy is it's a spiritual application from Paul, but it's also historical and future application on I guess the Arabs are going to persecute the Jewish people. All right, part 6. Enter at your own risk. I'm doing on time. All right, good. All right. 2007, Hamas is a militant Islamic group that takes over control of the Gaza Strip. We talked about this. So you see the land right there on the coast, just north of Egypt. That's where the Gaza Strip's at. So Hamas take it over. And then on October 7th, 2023, 3,000 Hamas in trucks, motorcycles, bulldozers, speedboats, and paragliders attack Israel. We'll cover this, but Israel, because of all the suicide bombings and everything, previously had built kind of a security wall and fence on the outskirts of Gaza and there's checkpoints between Gaza and Israel. And it's basically for the safety of course, if you read the U.S. news media, it's they're torturing the Gazans by not giving them free reign. But it makes sense the more we look at it. They're trying to just protect their people. So anyway, there's checkpoints. This coordinated attack, they go and there's kind of watchtowers where the Israeli guards are protecting this strip. They go and attack them, kill multiple of the guards, and there's videos of these huge swaths of the fence and walls that are just destroyed, and they're just driving all of their bulldozers and motorcycles and everything through, and they basically just flood Israel within 15 minutes. They basically are within the country. Within the first 20 minutes of this attack on October 7th, I read reports and they differed, so I put 3,000 to 5,000 rockets were fired directly into Israel. A Hamas official on the day of the report says the attack is an effort to create a permanent state of war and revive interest in the Palestinian cause. It says Hamas mutilated, tortured, and raped Israelis. On this attack on October the 7th, 1,200 Israelis were killed and 251 were taken hostage. I've got a video here, and it's graphic. I'm going to cut it a little bit short, but I think it's relevant when we hear on the news what Israel is doing to the poor people in Gaza and the poor people of Hamas and how they're treating them. I think it's relevant to watch at least a portion of this. What this is a video of is there was a music festival that was going on. It was a day of celebration. It was a holy day, but also a day of celebration in Israel, and they had a huge music festival. When the Hamas broke through, there was an alert that went out. You've got to get out of here because this music festival was within a couple miles of the Gaza-Israel border. So the people tried to basically escape. They said they got in their cars and it just became a log jam because there was so many people there. So they were just fishing a barrel. And they said they were getting out trying to just run and they were just getting mowed down and shot. So this is footage of the Israeli police that came through the music festival as soon as they got word. Hamas had already cleaned out. So this is footage from an Israeli police officer when he arrives at the music festival. This is what the Hamas did to these. As you'll see, it's a bunch of young women, appears to be late teens, early 20s women that were working and attending this music festival in Israel.
אוי ואבוי. יש פה הרוגים, כולם הרוגים, כל הבמה הרוגים. כל הבמה הרוגים. יש פה מישהו עם סימן חיים. תיתן לנו סימן חיים. מישהו שיכול לתת לנו סימן חיים. מישהו עם סימן חיים. שום סימן חיים?
So that's what happened on that day. I just pulled a couple headlines. Human shield horror. There's stories of the Hamas taking elderly women, that's small children as young as 6 months old, were taken as hostages. So Israel's response to this. Prime Minister Netanyahu had a video that he released to the nation of Israel. He said he's going to turn all places where Hamas is organized and hiding into cities of ruin. He called Gaza, quote, the city of evil. 20 days after the attack, 100,000 Israeli troops launched an incursion into Gaza. In March of 2024, one of the heads of Hamas, their head of internal security, was killed by the Israeli military. As of this week, 46,000 Palestinians have been killed. 66% of the Gaza Strip buildings have sustained some type of damage, and 90% of the inhabitants of Gaza have been displaced. Oh, I thought this was interesting. A couple months ago, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is tied into the UN in some way, one of their prosecutors applied for an arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu for what he did. So that's what Israel's dealing with in regards to the UN. We'll touch on the UN a lot more when we get into kind of modern history. So after literally their people are slaughtered, Netanyahu is the one who's going to be arrested. Of course, President Biden did come out and issued a response and said, this is ridiculous. We stand behind Israel. So President Biden took that stance. All right. So since that time, the war's been going on. We've seen some of the damage on both sides. we'll talk about now President Trump's position on this, the prisoner hostage swap, and then also the ceasefire agreement. Here's President Trump on January the 7th.
President-elect Donald Trump giving the terror organization this warning on Tuesday.
If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. And it will not be good for Hamas.
So he's pretty clear. This is actually a pretty funny video. It's about a 4-minute video, and it's kind of funny. But this guy that he's with, he is one of the chief negotiators that's working with the United States that's negotiating with Israel and the Hamas. So he's giving an update on everything, and President Trump steps in and says, "I don't want to mess up your negotiations, but let me say something." So you can see the guy's face like, "Oh boy." All right, the ceasefire agreement. Now, this started a week ago today. They've had on and off ceasefire agreements, but there's a ceasefire between the Hamas and the Israeli military that started on January the 19th. It's supposed to last for 42 days. I want your opinion on whether this is a fair agreement or if Israel is basically, we'll talk about land for peace a lot later, but let's talk about it. There's 3 phases to the agreement. 1, a prisoner hostage swap, along with humanitarian aid to Gaza. I want to go over what this prisoner hostage swap is. It says Hamas would release 33 women, children, and elderly. But they said, but if we can't come up with 33 of those, we'll just release dead bodies of the ones we've killed to make up for the other 33. Israel agreed to a 30-for-1 swap. So for every one Israeli hostage, Israel agreed to release 30 of the Hamas. Phase 2, the ceasefire will become permanent as long as phase 1 is completed. The Hamas will release the remaining living male hostages. And then 3, Hamas agrees to release the remains of the Israeli hostages that were killed. And then Israel will agree to basically begin lifting the blockade. As you're aware now, they basically have locked down Gaza for understandable reasons. All right, prisoner hostage swap. I thought this was interesting. On January 19th, the day that the ceasefire went into effect, Israel gave Hamas a deadline, and they said, at 8:30 a.m., you are to provide us the names of the 3 female Israelis you're going to release. Well, Hamas, if you know the way they negotiate, it's never fine. They don't release it. At 8:31, the news report says, Israel immediately began bombing Gaza again. By 11:30, 3 hours later, the 3 names were released, and they started making arrangements to release the 3 ladies. Make sure I have. All right, so the first 3 Israeli hostages that were released were the 3 ladies on the top left: Emily Damari, Romy Janin, and Darren Steinbrecher. These 3 ladies were taken hostage on October 7th. And then yesterday afternoon, about between 3 and 4 o'clock, the report came out that 4 more Israeli female soldiers had been released. And that's their pictures there in the middle. They've been held hostage as well. And let me read you this. And in exchange for these 4 women, here's what Israel released yesterday. Israel released 200 Palestinian prisoners. Of this group, 121 have been serving life sentences after being convicted of deadly attacks against Israelis. So it's like I used to feel bad. We'd get a mouse in my kitchen, and I'd have to put it on a trap, and I felt bad. I had the glue trap, so I took him out into the woods and put the oil so he could get loose, and of course he just ended up back in the house. So the third picture is in 7 days from today, the first American hostages are supposed to be released. And this is a picture of a guy named Sagai Chin. He is an American that's been living in Israel, and I thought his story was interesting. Mr. Chin worked on a farm. He had a wife and 2 young daughters. When Hamas was 200 yards out from his farm, he caught wind of it. He placed his wife and 2 young daughters in their bomb shelter and obviously didn't disclose their location. The wife talks about she overheard them basically capturing him and torturing him. His wife was also 7 months pregnant. So his wife had a baby in December of 2023 that he's never seen. He's up for release in 7 days, along with a couple other Americans. They haven't confirmed if he's alive or dead. Hamas have said in a couple instances, we're not going to tell you if they're alive or dead until we do the swap. So that's just one backstory. I got to read a bunch of these guys, kind of their backstory of who's been captured. All right. Does the Gaza attack violate any agreement? All right, Laban. Laban is from Syria. Syria, we saw on a map, is just directly north of Israel. And Syria in the Bible times, from what I've read, is a modern day kind of mix of Lebanon, where Hezbollah is at, and Syria. So Laban is a Syrian, an Arab. He has 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, that we know about. Leah and Rachel both married Jacob, who's obviously the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So he's in the lineage with Abraham and Isaac. So at the end of kind of their dealings, Laban goes to Jacob and says, hey, I want to make an agreement with you. So they enter into this covenant or this contract. And the agreement is this. Well, first off, it's important to know where the agreement was made. The yellow arrow there, I know that map's impossible to see, but it was made in the Mount Gilead, according to Genesis 31:23. And if you look at Mount Gilead, it's literally where Syria is at. It's to the east of Israel. Okay? So that's where the agreement's made, and that's relevant. So Laban provides the terms of the agreement. It says, behold this heap. They basically make a heap of rocks. It's basically to commemorate their agreement, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be a witness that I will not pass over this heap. The Syrians will not pass over this rocks into, they have to enter Israel, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their fathers, judge betwixt us. So anyway, there was an agreement there where Syria agreed to not enter into the Israeli land to do harm to the Israelis. So of course, that's been the promise, and they still make the promises today through peace negotiations or alleged peace negotiations. Another interesting point, I said, what is God of Nahor? So I got looking that up. Nahor is Abraham's brother. And Nahor goes from Ur up to Haran with Abraham and his dad and his family. But from everything I read, Nahor never went into Israel. So when Laban says the God of Abraham, our God, and the God of Nahor, the God outside of Israel. So this is a spiritual agreement that was made. Not just a political agreement, it was a spiritual agreement. All right. So I'm just kind of gathering questions, and I've got a whole list of stuff I want to ask Brother Freddie, and I'll open the floor up here. Questions I thought, why is Ishmael promised a nation? That to me, that's weird. I mean, and he's already touched on that some with me, but I think that's worth digging into. Somebody read the first line of Zephaniah 2:4.
Nice and loud.
I thought this was kind of interesting, what we just discussed.
Zephaniah 2:4.
For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up.
Yeah, what's the first land that's mentioned?
For Gaza shall be forsaken.
For Gaza shall be forsaken. I thought that was interesting when I got to looking up Gaza, and Gaza's even talking about being forsaken in Ezekiel. That's prophetical, but it's just interesting. And then my third question was, God tells Abraham, here's your land. Why is there a change in kind of the geography between the river in Egypt over to the Great River versus the division of land in Ezekiel 47 to 48. So that's another thing that kind of interested me when I was reading that. All right, so coming up in the next couple of weeks, next week, I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit, but the main focus is going to be what happened to this land of Israel once Abraham and his lineage entered into it. I know we know a lot of the basic history, but we're going to cover that. And then we're going to move into kind of once the Bible ends, up through the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement was something that began in the late 1800s. And we'll talk about the men that kind of started that, where there was kind of a call for the Jews throughout basically all of Europe and the Middle East and even Africa to basically start regathering into the land that we've been talking about. So what happened for Israel to become a nation? As of 1917, there were basically, it wasn't recognized at all in 1917. The end of World War I, a lot of events happened, and then there's some stuff that happens all the way up to May 14th of 1948 when Israel announces itself as a nation. Just out of curiosity, and we'll hit this, who was the first political leader to recognize Israel as a nation on May 14th, 1948? 11 minutes later, President Truman gave a speech to recognize Israel as a nation and said that they were going to stand behind that. And then we're going to start talking more about what is Palestine, what does it mean in the Bible, and then what is Palestine now? Is Palestine a place? Is it a city? Is it a location? Is it a people? And then we're going to talk about West Bank and Gaza and how does that fit into this land of Israel? Because if you look at maps, that's part of Israel. And then we're going to talk about the wars. We're going to talk about the 6-Day War and all the land they overtook. We're going to talk about the Yom Kippur War and how that blew up on all these countries. We're going to talk about some of the deals that were made, and the U.S. presidents had a major part in trying to reach peace agreements. President Clinton did, President Carter did. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some of the opponents and the factions that are against Israel in a couple weeks. So I'll open the floor up. If there's questions, or Brother Freddie, want to touch on some stuff?
Yeah, we got about 4 minutes. Y'all turn those lights on. I'll take your Bible and go to Deuteronomy chapter 11. They got y'all's interest up? Oh, yeah. Isn't it great? Deuteronomy chapter 11. Deuteronomy chapter 11. Now, it's just hard for me to sit there. I just give you a little recommendation. I wouldn't buy pagers from overseas if I were you. Deuteronomy chapter number 11. This is Moses giving out some more things about what the Lord said. But notice verse 10 in Deuteronomy 11. He says, "For the land whither thou goest in to possess it is not as the land of Egypt, whence you came out, where thou sowest thy seed and waterest it with thy foot as the garden of herbs. But the land whither you go to possess it is a land of hills and valleys, and drinketh water of the rain of heaven." Notice verse 12. "The land which the Lord thy God careth for, the eyes of the Lord thy God are always upon it."
Yes.
"From the beginning of the year even to the end of the year." Now, because of our time this morning, I'm gonna try to leave you hanging just a little bit. But this land, when we cover the specifics of the past history and the prophetical, the Lord purchased that land. He paid for it.
Yes, it is.
Now, I'll give you one more verse, and I'm going to kind of leave you hanging. Look at the book of Joel. It's after the book of Daniel. Make it a little easier for you to find. Before Matthew, but after the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, Daniel. And that way, look at Joel chapter 3. The land means something. It isn't just when he showed you that world map, you think about how small that area is. Why don't y'all just go somewhere else on the planet? When you got all that desert y'all are trying to make green.
Yeah.
Why don't y'all just pick a piece of dirt and build on it? But why are y'all fighting over that little piece of property? Because the Lord paid for it. It's His. And so anyway. Look at Joel chapter 3. And obviously some of this is future, but notice verse 1. I'm just going to kind of leave you hanging. "For behold, In those days and that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations, and I will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage, watch closely, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. And notice what the Lord says, and they've done what to the land? So anytime our country, this has been one of the faults of America, I thought it's interesting that the president who validated Israel was called True Man.
He was a Baptist.
I'm sure that's not coincidental.
Right.
So every time America, if you'll go back and look in the last 40 years, every time America has told Israel to give up some of their land, we've had some natural catastrophe.
Yeah.
That land doesn't belong to us, and you have no business giving it away. So that land is his land. There's about 5 verses that are referenced to as the Lord's land. Okay, so I'm gonna leave you hanging. Anything else? Everybody interested in next week already? All right, you guys are dismissed. Give you time.